Today, we are going to be looking at some Hollywood storytelling secrets that you can use so that you can tell better stories in your public speaking. And to do that, I've invited a guest today. His name is Jeff Barch, and he's going to be talking a little bit about how, as an editor in Hollywood, he learned some things that we can apply. Let me tell you a little bit about Jeff. He's a coach and an entrepreneur. He's been doing that for 20 years and editing broadcast level content that you have seen. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But he lived in Los Angeles for many years, editing for NBC, ABC, Universal, Disney, Apple, many others. He's been featured in USA Today and Time Magazine. He's the author of a book called Edit Better: Hollywood Tested Strategies for Powerful Video Editing. And he's the founder of Story Greenlight. That's a community that empowers online creators, and a YouTube channel, which I will put a link to in the description below. How are you today, Jeff?
Doing awesome. Good to be here, man.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. So I believe, Jeff, and I want to talk to my viewers right now, that the best public speakers are storytellers. Essentially, those high-level professional speakers all are just great at telling stories. That's what separates the average speaker from the pros. But a lot of times as beginners, we don't know how to get started in storytelling, and we end up being long-winded, we ramble, and then our stories don't make a point. And I wanted to talk to you today because I think it can help us beginners save a lot of trial and error, bumping into ourselves trying to tell these good stories, if we learn the recipe for good storytelling from a guy like you who knows all about it. So before we get to that, though, I'm wondering, Jeff, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started in video and in editing and where you are now.
Yeah. It actually started when I was 5 years old and I learned how to start playing piano. And when I got into junior high, I got into music recording and creating on that musical side and audio side of things. And when I got into high school, it was, this was literally before the internet existed. And
right.
When you're shooting a video, you had to walk around with a full-size camera on your shoulder. So I was the only one in my entire high school who cared anything about that. So I had to figure it out. I had to be the one-man band. And what ended up happening was, when I was done with every project, I took a stack of tapes into the state-funded education agency. I was too young to drive. My mom drove me an hour to the editing suite. And I found out that all this stuff that I'd been shooting and all the music that I'd been arranging and recording, it all comes together in this editing part. And I just fell in love with it. And so I ended up going to film school. I ended up in Los Angeles, going to film school, ran out of money, got into the entertainment industry as an assistant editor. And I made the jump to full editor, and that's what I've been doing freelance ever since. So that's where things started. And I've actually, I've ended up, when people ask, what kind of stuff have you done? The answer is usually a lot of shows that a lot of people haven't heard of. But one of the main shows that people seem to have heard of a lot is a show called American Ninja Warrior on NBC. Yeah. And it's gearing up for its 14th season as we speak right here. And the cool part about that is the show itself it shows people going across a huge obstacle course, but but before they do that, most of the time you see a story package saying, who is this athlete and why should you care about them? That's the stuff that I get to do. I've been doing that short form storytelling for Ninja for years now. And that's one of the favorite shows I've ever worked on. And
it's amazing. And by the way, those stories are what grip the viewer. Of course, we want to see people doing amazing athletic things, but when we hear their story, now we care about them, not just what they can do on the course. So it's basically, we are rooting for them because we've gotten to know them through the stories that you've told.
And I will say, there are some people who look at the show and they say, stop with all the stories. This is dumb. We just want to see people get on the course.
Right.
I'm telling you, if you don't have the story, you don't care what the person does on the course. The story is what makes people care.
That's right. And that's the lesson for public speaking. The story is what makes us care. If you've ever heard a good story in a speech, it is the thing that will draw you in to that message and make you care. So based upon your experience telling stories through editing video, what are the key talking points or structure that a good story should have?
Sure. There is a general framework that any story follows. And as far as I know, this applies to the Western world. This also applies to the Eastern world. You know, there are different ways that people see the world in Western thought versus Eastern thought. As far as I know, this applies to everyone everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a story, the master framework for telling any story goes like this. You have a character who wants something, who overcomes obstacles to get it, and experiences transformation as a result. It's those mm-hmm. three parts right there. Mm-hmm. And that is the framework that can expand. You can shrink it down just from those ideas. You can shrink it down even further, and it can be the foundation of a 5-second snippet of video. Mm-hmm. It can expand and get a whole bunch more moving parts, and it can be a 20 episode series.
Right.
So it's this massive accordion, but it all comes down to these ideas of the character who wants something, overcomes obstacles to get it, and what the change is, the transformation that happens at the end.
That's fantastic. Before we get to, I'm already hearing a lot of public speaking applications, but before we get there, let's talk about a film that everybody would know where they can see this play out.
Most people can fairly easily latch onto the idea of Star Wars. Especially when you have the idea of Luke Skywalker. He starts out as a kind of a whiny brat living on the farm with his relatives.
Right.
And he goes off on this adventure. He's going off looking for these droids. And he's dreaming of being part of the resistance. Part of being he wants to be a Jedi Knight, and he wants to be part of this resistance. He wants something more than his boring life on the farm.
So there's point number one, at least what I'm hearing, is a character who wants something.
He wants something more than what he has. He wants his life to be more than what it is.
Okay.
And through the different episodes, he goes through all these adventures, all these roadblocks, all these obstacles, all these dangers, all these monsters, all these gangsters, all this stuff, all the people along the way who help him.
That's point number two. He's overcoming obstacles to get there. Okay, I'm following.
and as his story progresses, he becomes, he ends up meeting with his mentor Yoda, who helps him overcome some even more obstacles in his mind. And through that journey, he ends up becoming a mature Jedi Knight. So the whiny farm boy goes through this journey, and he becomes a mature Jedi Knight.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we don't have to go into this, but each of those separate movies has the story arc as well. So the three movies, the three original movies hang together and wasn't one big story, but each piece also tells its own segment of that story. So that's where you're talking about the structure can be expanded to fit the length of the story you want to tell, or it can be compressed. So in public speaking situations, we might be telling a 60-second story, but we can still use those same points. A character who wants something, overcomes obstacles to get it, and then experiences transformation and growth as a result. Let's do one more. We talked earlier about The Wizard of Oz. Can you go through that one really quickly? Because I'm sure a lot of people have seen that.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, it's actually really similar. Instead of Luke Skywalker being the whiny young man on the farm, you have Dorothy, who is she's living on a farm, and she's not happy with her life. She wishes that her life was more interesting. And all of a sudden, this tornado comes through, and she goes through this whole journey of what she wants. She realizes she's away from home, and she wants to get back home, but there are all these obstacles in her way. There are all these things, and all these friends come along, and they want things for themselves. They have things that they want, and they come to the end of their journey and they realize they had these things within them all along.
Mhm.
And when Dorothy wakes up in her bed, she realizes, I am home. There's no place like home.
No place like home.
Yeah.
One of the great, and the line at the end of the story means so much more than, if you've never seen it, doesn't mean anything. But once you see it, you go, oh, wow, that really lands. So that's the structure. Let's turn now to everyday conversation, everyday life. What's an example of this story structure playing out in everyday life? I think you might have mentioned to me before just a little experience your wife would go through or that you would go through in a day.
Well, I cannot tell you how many times my wife is getting ready for making dinner and she says, okay, I have some asparagus, I have some broccoli. How should I roast the broccoli? She says, okay, I'm going to go on Pinterest and say, I want to learn I want a new idea for how I can roast broccoli.
So she's a character who wants something.
She wants to know, how can she get a new idea for roasting broccoli? Right. She goes on to Pinterest and pops an article. We'll show you how to roast broccoli. Great. She clicks on it and it starts out, there are 13 pictures and 13 advertisements. And then there's a whole bunch of copy. There's a whole blog post saying this recipe came from my grandfather. My grandfather came from the old country. He was an angry man with only 3 fingers on one hand. And my wife was standing there. For the love of all that's holy, how can I roast the broccoli? You know? And so, so that's the obstacle. Just show me the recipe, for crying out loud.
Right.
She eventually gets there and she swears that she's never going to go on Pinterest again. So I don't know if that ends up being an actual transformation, an actual change of mind for her.
There's some change though. There's something going on where she's different at the end. Well, I love this because, once you know this framework, you see it absolutely everywhere. You see it absolutely everywhere. So I want to change now and talk a little bit about even more public speaking in terms of, where can we get these stories? And one of the places I think we can get them is through our personal experience, right? If 100%. You're a public speaker, you're looking at your own life and you're saying, okay, well, what kinds of messages do I have in me that I can share? So I think you can look at your own, just like you just did with your wife. It's a simple little thing. You could make a story out of going to the store or going to get gas. The framework can apply to almost anything. But I think one of the places that we look in our own life, right? What have we been going through? What are some illustrations? Or we can read books and we can learn about other people. I think the most powerful lessons, though, come from our own life.
Yeah. And I would say that one of the most powerful elements of any story comes from that third part of the framework. We can, you can condense those ideas down. You start with a character who wants something, overcomes conflict to get it, and experiences transformation as a result. You can take that down to 3 individual words. There's a character, well, you can say it's desire, obstacles, and change. And if you had to only think about one word when it comes to telling stories, it's that last word, change.
Change.
The idea of change is one of the most powerful ideas that fascinates the human mind and the human spirit. And so, as you're saying, if we talk about stories from our own personal experience, and we talk about how things changed. I used to think this, now I think that. Or
before and after.
Before and after. It's that right there. You are good to go for telling your stories.
My dog is trying to jump on me. Sorry. Must be time to eat. She's got her own little story. She's trying to overcome this obstacle and get some food. So
stop ignoring me. You are being my obstacle.
That's right. So question, when you're editing, you are going through a very similar process that public speakers are going through. You have to decide what to include and what to cut. And one of the biggest problems for public speakers is they ramble. They can't make decisions. I don't know what to say, what to cut out. I want to say, and they end up rambling and it's long-winded and then it doesn't feel like a story. So what kind of guidelines would you recommend when we are making stories about what to cut and what to keep when we are crafting our stories for presentations?
Sure. The number one thing that you can do is keep things shorter than you think they need to be. I cannot tell you how many times I've cut a scene that I think is the right length that it needs to be. And for whatever reason, I get notes from a producer or from an executive, and they say, okay, well, we need to take this part out and just let's reorder that. And all of a sudden things go shoot, and it just gets even more tight and condensed. And I'm sitting there scratching my head thinking, man, it gets better almost every single time. Now, obviously there is, you can take it too far, you can cut things down too far, and you take out important elements. So you do have to strike a balance, but that will be the number one thing is be willing to leave things out, not include every single detail.
Yeah, that's great advice. That takes discipline, but I have found the same thing in my own presentations. I just leave some things out and the story gets smoother, it stays on point, and then it has the impact that I want it to have.
Yeah.
So before we all go, I want to speak directly to viewers. Here's my recommendation in terms of next steps. Start telling stories. A lot of people say, I want to get better at telling stories. And I say, what are you doing for telling? Oh, I'm not telling any yet. Start telling stories. Just get some practice time and get some reps in, and then shoot for 1-minute stories. If you're doing a presentation and it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, try to put a 1-minute story in there. And then try to, in your next presentation, try to put 2 1-minute stories in there, and so forth. Stick to a 1-minute story, because at least that's a guidepost that'll help you make some decisions about what to cut and what to leave in. And then the goal is to, if you're doing a 10 or 15-minute presentation, you want that handful of stories in there, that 3, 4, 5, 6 stories that create an overall message and tie together to the bigger message that your presentation is driving toward.
This is so incredibly important. I just want to reiterate on this. Humanity is connected by storytelling. Mm-hmm. And when we actually tell stories that talk about, here's how I'm feeling, that is an incredibly powerful way to connect human emotion to whatever you're talking about. It's a psychological effect where you are making people feel things, and you are attaching those feelings to the rest of their experience that they're having with you in your talk that you're giving. So if you're ever wondering, okay, well, really, what's the most important part of this? Yes, keep things short. Yes, follow that framework. Yes, talk about how things changed, but also talk about how you or the people in the story feel about the change.
Absolutely. I was just saying in a different video that I was working on that when we experience that emotional connection, our message will travel from listeners' head to their heart. And that's where we remember. Jeff, thanks so much for being here today. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always.
Glad to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
See you all soon.